Hello everyone, and welcome to the 38th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Walter White from Breaking Bad. This character will be the first anti-hero I've covered on this channel, and there's quite a lot about him that's sympathetic, especially in the earlier seasons of this show. Unlike a few other notable anti-heroes like Tony Soprano, whom you'll be getting an episode on very soon, Walter's actions and intentions from the beginning may be reprehensible, but they aren't exactly what you would call evil. Instead, this character is one who undergoes a gradual evolution over the course of this show, beginning as the very definition of your average middle American, and ending up as a cold-blooded and ruthless drug lord, who, while still remaining sympathetic as our protagonist, undoubtedly becomes the villain of his own story. This is going to be a rather lengthy introduction, but I think it's important that we touch on a few things before we continue. First is the topic of drugs. I'm not here to comment on the morality of using drugs, or whether or not they should be illegal, or what have you. I'm aware that plenty of legitimate businesses do terrible things in this world, and opinions on this subject are varied. But I think we can all agree that meth isn't exactly the greatest thing in the world, and whether legitimate or not, the world would probably be a much better place without it. I'd like to make it clear, we're examining Walt, and though meth is the catalyst for his downfall, it's his actions and the change in his character that turn Walt from a well-intentioned and relatively harmless individual to nothing short of a power-hungry monster. The second thing that I'd like to touch on is crime, which can be a nuanced subject depending on the circumstances. For example, robbing a bank may not seem like it's too terrible a crime to commit. After all, as Spooge attempts to argue in this show, it's a victimless crime if nobody's hurt, as the banks are insured, so what's the harm? But there are so many other factors you need to consider in such a scenario. When you rob a bank, you're not just taking the money, but you're also putting the lives of civilians and officers of the law at risk, including the tellers, bankers, customers, and even pedestrians if there's a chase following the robbery. And on and on and on. The same could be said for murder that's committed as the result of, or in service to, criminal enterprises. Nobody joins the mafia and assumes it's going to be all daisies and roses. Everyone participating in these activities knows the rules of the game, so to speak. And in that way, some of the murders a person may commit while partaking in criminal activity may be more forgivable in a sense, as the only people you may be hurting are other criminals. However, as with robbing a bank, there are many facets to crime that cause horrible repercussions for people who aren't involved in these endeavors. Collateral damage, if you will. And the act of upholding a culture and business that actively deals in the harm or endangerment of individuals is something that shouldn't be taken lightly or encouraged. These anti-hero characters are ones we love to watch, and we're made to be sympathetic towards them, as we see them with their families, and living ordinary lives not unlike the rest of us. However, that doesn't make their actions any less reprehensible, and an ordinary day-to-day life does not make up for the evil a person commits. I will be pointing out the crimes he commits in this series that are understandable, and perhaps forgivable in a sense, but I wanted to make these two notions clear before proceeding with this video. I've thought a lot about how to structure this video. As though there's a lot of material to work with here, there's points in this series where it's rather redundant to cover every little thing that happens to Walt, or what Walt does, as these events don't change much about his overall character. As an example, there are big things in all of our lives that happen to us, or that we do, that don't totally alter our own personalities, and this is the same for Walt. With that said, this video will be divided into 4 sections corresponding to the 4 most important periods we're privy to, those being a brief section on Walt's backstory, the time before Walt begins working for Gus, Walt's time working for Gus, and after Gus's demise. Now without further ado, let's begin. As far as Walt's background is concerned, we only have a few things to go off of here. First is the fact that Walt has an estranged relationship with the only family we know of outside his immediate circle, his mom. And though she's mentioned a few times throughout the series, we never see or hear from her at all. During a scene between Walt and Walt Jr., Walt talks about his dad, who's been dead since he was 6 years old, and how his last memories of the man are ones of pain and heartbreak, as all he can remember of his dad is how he looked and sounded as he lay dying on his deathbed. His relationship with his mom is telling of something that we'll be discussing quite often throughout this video, and that's the fact that Walt tends to avoid uncomfortable emotional and familial scenarios rather than address them head on. as whenever he speaks of his mom, he does so in a way that indicates that she's more of an annoyance in his life, more than anything. Next, we have Walt's education and career prior to becoming a teacher. During his time as a student, he earned an award for his research into X-ray crystallography, which he was given for his contribution to research that earned the Nobel Prize. I'm going to highlight something here that I won't be bringing up later on in this video, and that's the fact that Walt is clearly a genius, and not just in chemistry, but in mechanics, mathematics, and planning. He has a complex mind that is well suited to problem solving, and his ingenuity in nearly all of his endeavors is what brings about much of his success throughout this series. After graduating, he went on to found Gray Matter Technologies with Elliot, where he met Gretchen and developed a relationship with her, and eventually becoming engaged to her. After meeting her family during a 4th of July weekend, Walt suddenly, and without warning, cut off his relationship with Gretchen, and sold his stake in Gray Matter, completely severing his ties with both Elliot and Gretchen. We aren't given much insight into this incident in the show, but in 2016, Vince Gilligan stated in an interview that the reason Walt left Gretchen was due to the wealth of her family and the inferiority he felt at this revelation, knowing that if he went on to marry her, he would forever live in the shadow of their wealth, a notion that Walt's pride couldn't take. Even though it's obviously his own fault that Walt lost out on the success of Gray Matter, he still blames Elliot and Gretchen for his failures, and by the time of the pilot, his relationship with them has become strained. Now, this aspect of Walt that caused him to sever his ties with them is something that we find ourselves coming in contact with quite often during this series. I can't say where this pride came from, as again, we have little to go off of in the way of a background for Walt, especially where his childhood is concerned, but it is perhaps the most detrimental aspect of Walt, and his pride is something I'll be mentioning frequently as we move forward. After leaving Elliot and Gretchen behind, Walt went on to work in various research labs over the years, eventually meeting Skylar at a diner he frequented on his lunch hour, where she worked as a hostess. Soon after, they would marry, and Skylar would become pregnant with Walter Jr., at which time they ventured into purchasing their first home in anticipation of the new baby. In this scene, Walt tells Skylar that they need to find a bigger house because they'll be having more children in the future, and when she responds that it's not within their budget, Walt wonders why they shouldn't take risks and attempt to live outside of their means, as they have nowhere to go but up. For reasons unknown to us, this is decidedly not the case, as Walt ends up teaching at a high school, leaving them living at a subsistence level at their new home, a level which is barely enough to keep them afloat, let alone comfortable, in their new lives as a married couple. Now, this isn't exactly a lot of information to go off of, but aside from showing us a bit of his pride, and the way he handles his emotions and familial relations, this backstory does tell us two key things about Walt that are inherent to his character. The fact that he's always dreamt of bigger things, and that he once had a promising career and future that was stripped from him, partially due to his own shortcomings, and for reasons unknown. With this information, we can move on to who Walt is at the beginning of this series up until the time he begins working for Gus Fring. Now, this backstory may be small, but it does give us great insight into what we're given at the very beginning of the show. A man who's now past his prime, one who's fallen from greatness, and reduced to teaching high school chemistry. To add further insult to what he likely perceives as an already underwhelming career, he's forced to make ends meet working at a car wash. Add these two depressing factors into your average, run-of-the-mill middle America lifestyle, with a boring marriage as an addition, and you have the perfect recipe for a deeply unsatisfied man. In these early stages, he's rather meek and mild-mannered, enforcing the rules of his class with a light touch, and he shies away from the more abrasive conversations that men like Hank are partial to. And he seems to be one who acquiesces to the wishes of his wife, being the one who brings in the money, but not the one who's making any of the decisions in the household, giving us the impression that he's become beaten down and reduced to a shadow of the promising man he had once been. It's no wonder, then, that once he's given a diagnosis of lung cancer, that he suddenly gains perspective into his bland, milquetoast life, and all that it's amounted to. As we know, he doesn't tell his wife about his diagnosis, acting much the same way as he does with his mom, preferring to avoid whatever headache he would receive as a result of revealing these truths or engaging in a deeper way with his family, putting off this revelation until the last minute. As we see quite often throughout the series, he's the kind of man who prefers silence over emotional engagement, preferring to live as more of a stoic than a person who talks openly about their feelings. Now, I assume that before this point in his life, He'd essentially resigned himself to working his 2 jobs, and just trying to get by with what little he can. I'm sure any of us can imagine what a virtual death sentence would do to our perspective on our own lives. Perhaps you would travel the world, or live out your fantasies with the time you have left. For Walter, it brings nothing more than an added layer of misery and despair, as what options does a man with a family he's barely providing for now have? With a baby on the way, a child still in high school, and a mortgage, who's going to provide when he's gone? That's not to say he has no options at all, as there are always options for a person, even if they might be grim. But it's easy to understand why Walt turns to an alternate and highly dangerous method of making money once he's given his diagnosis. Not only that, but why his attitude has started to adjust towards a nothing matters anymore, so why not mentality. This is the larval stage of the Walter White we come to know as time goes on. He's a bit gruff, abrasive, and has a temper that manifests with an overall renewed vigor and confidence after his diagnosis. But otherwise, he's an unremarkable man with a remarkable set of talents, who's only looking to provide security and safety for his family after he's gone. He isn't doing this for any overly ambitious reasons. His intentions at this point are as pure as they can be when indulging in the manufacture of narcotics. Here, he isn't proud of what he's doing by any means, especially after he thinks he's murdered both Emilio and Crazy 8, which he feels enormously guilty for, even though it was done in self-defense. He's incredibly naive in regard to anything to do with a criminal lifestyle, and sees thugs like Crazy 8 as average, rational human beings, a notion that ultimately leads to him almost surrendering his life to Crazy 8 for a second time after he attempts to treat him with respect and understanding. Even when he's trying to assert himself towards his wife, it's almost innocent in the way that he tells her to back off, as he never raises his voice, and politely tells her, with some swearing, to get off his back. As I mentioned earlier, one thing Walt has in abundance is pride, a deep-seated, detrimental, bottomless well of pride. We see a small amount of his pride manifest when Hank tells him that he'll take care of his family no matter what happens, but it really shines through for the first time when he shoots down Elliot's job offer. I mentioned before that a person always has options when it comes to an illness, and those options can be quite grim. Here, though, is a 1 in a million opportunity, a friend who is willing to provide you with a well-paying job, great health insurance, and even the money for your treatment, an offer you'd honestly be quite stupid to turn down. There is, of course, what happened between the 3 of them in the past, and Walt's desire not to go through treatment at all, which he explains quite well during his intervention, where he states his desire to have a choice in the matter of his own destiny, the ability to decide for himself how he will suffer, and how he will live out his last days on Earth. But even so, if you're willing to commit crimes to provide for your family, you think you might be a bit more willing to bite the bullet and let old wounds heal in order to provide for them in a much more safe and secure way. Not Walt, not a man who's got such an inflated ego, an overtly macho sense of pride, that even after he's committed 2 murders, which understandably shook him to his core, he still chooses to resort to manufacturing drugs just so he can have the satisfaction of knowing he was capable of providing for himself and his family without outside help. And this is how he transitions into the monster he eventually becomes, with baby steps, as Walt is now actively choosing to refuse legitimate help from a friend, and is instead lying to his family, endangering them and himself, and pursuing monetary gain through illegal activity, all to satisfy his own ego. This is only the beginning, and the real transformation of Walter White doesn't occur until after Jesse is beaten up by Tuco, a matter that he takes both on a personal and professional level. Even so, his intentions are still selfless, even if his pursuit of his goals is selfish, and his actions aren't too terrible as of yet, and he's still fairly afraid of the ramifications of being a criminal, as we see when he's visibly shaken up after Tuco murders Nodos. Even his plot to murder Tuco isn't exactly malicious, as this is in self-defense more than anything. Outside of his criminal activities, his lies to his family are his biggest transgressions at this time in his life. His relationship with his wife grows increasingly strained as he tries to overcompensate for his supposed fugue state and skirt around her constant absences that he has no right to argue over. His attempts at avoiding conflict with his wife have only resulted in more trouble for Walter, as at this point, he's tried to hide his cancer, his relationship with Jesse, and his whereabouts in order to lessen the load he might have to bear if these truths were revealed. However, All these lies have brought him nothing more than exactly what he was trying to avoid, which is almost always the result you get from constant lies. Though he's grown more brazen after the death of Tuco, Walt at this time is still very much hesitant to become a full-fledged criminal, shying away from Jesse's suggestion of becoming a distributor. However, once the money starts coming in, his attitude changes, and it changes even more when his kick is light. In one moment, he's hesitant about becoming a distributor, and in the next, he's suggesting violence after Skinny Pete is ripped off. And not just violence, but potentially murder. He does tell Jesse after the fact that he only meant for him to intimidate the people who stole from him, but the way he suggested it to Jesse in the first place definitely gave off the impression that he meant otherwise. His show of force toward Tuco may have been the beginning of his descent into darkness, but this suggestion is one that accelerates this descent, as this is Walt's first actual order he gives that is of a more malicious nature. This is still in self-defense in a way, as he's attempting to protect his interests in this business, but it's still one hell of a step to take. Walter at this point is well on the way to morphing from the average, middle American doormat husband to a ruthless and assertive man who takes what he wants and says whatever he likes. Our first real glimpse of his enhanced vigor outside of his increased libido is his encounter with Gretchen after she visits his home, where he becomes abrasive and withdrawn, arguing with Gretchen about the role she has in his life and how little she deserves any kind of explanation from Walt on the matter, ending this conversation by spitting verbal venom at her as he tells her off. And in the following episode, he has an exchange with a student in much the same way, which is an emerging personality that is in stark contrast to the man we met at the beginning of this series. As I said before, he was hesitant about becoming a distributor, but his hesitations become non-existent once he realizes that the entire city of Albuquerque fears Jesse after word gets out that he's the one who supposedly killed Spooge. Though we've seen a bit of this already, this is a great example of Walt being a man who capitalizes on any potential opportunity he sees. And this is a huge one that will increase his capacity to obtain the amount of money he needs before he dies, which, at this time, is still his primary goal. Something that seems minor in how quickly the moment comes and goes is Walter's willingness to have Badger killed in prison after his arrest, giving Jesse a look as if to say that it's what he thinks they should do after Saul suggests it. Another indicator that Walt is beginning to see the world in a much different way, and his apprehension towards murder is beginning to diminish. Soon after, Walt finds out he won't be dying as soon as he had hoped, which is an odd thing to hope for, but it makes sense when you consider if he does live, he'll have to live with the ramifications of what he's done, and there's no way out now. So, in an attempt to make up for what he sees as the inevitable revelation of his illegal activities, he begins fixing up his house and trying to distract himself from the fact that he may very well have ruined a life he has to live now, which is also another way for Walt to give his life some purpose now that his life is going to go back to being painfully mundane, though this renewed interest in his house doesn't last for long. Once he spies someone at a hardware store attempting to set up their own meth lab, Walter's greatest weakness kicks in once again. His pride which won't allow people in his town to encroach on what he believes is his, muddying up the market with their inferior product. This is even more apparent later on, when Walt is unwilling to launder his money in a way that would make it seem like the money came from luck or a benefactor. Instead, he needs the validation that his hard work will be recognized, that his family will know that he was the one who provided for their future, which is another reason he would have liked to die, as he wouldn't have been around to suffer the consequences of his family's scorn over how he made his money. After Combo is murdered, he even starts talking about setting up a bigger organization, commenting that they need to employ foot soldiers and get payback for Combo's murder, showing us that Walter is seriously considering stepping up to become a drug lord, even if he may still be hesitant at the prospect at the moment, seeing as how he would much rather prefer to get set up with Saul's potential distributor than go it on his own, even after his negative experience with Tuco. Now, before he had this run-in at the hardware store, one thing you really couldn't say about Walt is that he was greedy, as everything he was doing was budgeted in a way to provide for his family at a bare minimum level, ensuring that they would have their bills paid and that his children went to college. But he was never working to provide for them more than what they had now. But now, his perspective is changing. He's seeing now that if he doesn't die, he has to go back to a life he was miserable living, with a house that's crumbling beneath his feet, and a world where luxuries are few and far between. As I mentioned in his backstory, Walt has always wanted a bigger life, and now that he's going to be amongst the living, he's no longer in a hurry to provide what he can to his family in the event of his demise. Now he's wondering what heights he could reach, and to what degree he could improve the lives of his family members and himself. However, there's something standing in the way of his expansion into the drug trade, and that's Jesse's increasing unreliability. Though Walt has his moments where his emotions get the better of him during his endeavors, Jesse is far more susceptible to the horrors of their trade, which we've seen a number of times already, namely after the murders of Emilio, Crazy 8, No-Dos, Tuco, Spooge, and Combo, all of which wear Jesse down to the point that after Combo, a close friend of his, is murdered, he once again resorts to using drugs to deal with his sorrow, and now that he has a partner who's participating in this behavior with him, he's digging himself into an even deeper hole. This increased drug use jeopardizes the deal with Gus, and after Walt saves the deal, it almost falls through once again because Jesse is so out of his mind on heroin, he can barely form a coherent sentence. This is as good a time as any to talk about Walt and Jesse's relationship during this period, which has evolved significantly over time. Where once Walt viewed Jesse as nothing more than a worthless junkie who was his ticket to a mass amount of cash, he has now taken on sort of a fatherly role for Jesse, actively trying to get Jesse to better himself and improve their business. There's a flashback in El Camino that supports this idea, where Walt is actively concerned with Jesse's future, attempting to nudge him in the direction of going to college, which shows us that he undeniably cares for Jesse in a much bigger way outside their business dealings. His attitude towards Jesse is still certainly quite selfish, in that he's trying to improve his life in order to make their business run more smoothly. But there's another component I mentioned that we have to consider here, the fact that Walt views Jesse as his son, and more importantly, a son who can carry on his legacy when he's gone. Walt has Walter Jr., and there's no reason he won't succeed in his own right, but he's never going to follow in Walt's footsteps, and due to his condition, he wouldn't be able to, even if he were to try. Jesse, however, is perfectly capable of filling this role, and by the time Jesse is attempting to sever their relationship in favor of his relationship with Jane, Walt has come to care for Jesse almost as much as a member of his own family, and his reasons for trying to keep him involved in this business are always underscored by this notion. This is what brings Walt to a situation where he commits his first true act of evil, letting Jane die. This act is, in a way, done to improve Jesse's life, but is on the whole an incredibly selfish act. There's a lot of things that could be said about Walt letting Jane die. For example, it could be argued that she had done this to herself, as Walter wasn't the one who put the needle in her arm. And this could even be seen as self-defense in a way, as she was threatening to blackmail him, and he had no real way of knowing whether or not she would keep her mouth shut. However, I believe this scene, and the consequences of his actions following this scene, are meant to highlight the fact that the selfish and terrible actions a person takes inevitably have an effect on other people. Walter didn't just let Jane die, he let Donald's daughter die, and Jesse's lover. And due to his actions, 167 people who otherwise wouldn't have, had Donald been in the right state of mind. Maybe Jane would have never gotten better. Maybe her actions would have resulted in the downfall of Jesse, or any number of unfortunate possibilities. Or she and Jesse could have turned their lives around and lived happily ever after in New Zealand. But either way, none of who Jane is, or was, is Walt's decision to make. We can only do what we are capable of doing. We can try and help people, but ultimately their decisions are their decisions, and they must suffer the consequences of their decisions. But if we can do something, if we can save someone's life, it's more than likely that we should, as we don't know how a person's life is going to play out until it does. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course. If a post-trial Ted Bundy were drowning, I doubt many of us would throw him a life preserver. But all of the events leading up to Jane's death wouldn't have occurred had Walt not gotten involved in the manufacturing of meth in the first place. All of what I've said about Jane can apply to a number of different things that happen in this story, but the point here is that one terrible decision, no matter how big or how small, can ultimately result in an untold amount of consequences. There's going to be some conflicting views on this issue, I'm sure, but in essence, I believe this is what this scene was trying to convey. And though we may be sympathetic to Walter and his reasonings for letting Jane die, at the end of the day, I think we still need to recognize that this was the wrong thing to do, even if it hadn't resulted in all the deaths that followed. This serves to bring Walter closer to Jesse, either out of guilt or something else, and it also helps Jesse in that it gets him to go to rehab, but the ramifications of this single act are horrifying to say the least. And the moment those two planes crash above Albuquerque serve as a grand crescendo to end this chapter in Walt's life. A chapter that's marked by the revelation of his lies as Skylar dug deeper into his actions, depriving Walt of his family, the very family he had begun this endeavor for in the first place. At this time, we have a Walter whose grand intentions have been muddied by his own lies and actions, and the unfortunately fortunate news of his life expectancy being extended has brought him to a point where his pride has simultaneously brought him much higher than he had been when he started out, but much lower at the same time. And now, we follow Walt into the next chapter of his life, his time working for Gus Fring. After a back-and-forth struggle with his wife for their marriage, Skylar's infidelity, and an unknown to him near-death experience at the hands of the twins, Walt finds himself not so comfortably back at home, and in a position of hard pride once again. Jesse has decided to go his own way and cook meth without Walt, which infuriates Walt's sense of pride, as he believes and knows he's the best, and anyone who attempts to mimic his product is tarnishing his legacy. After separating from Jesse, he's subject to a ploy from his soon-to-be employer, Gus Fring, who plays both of them against each other, goading Walt into cooking meth again. To tantalize him further, he hangs a carrot in front of his face in the form of a lab, a well-kept, state-of-the-art chemical laboratory, one that Walt has been pining to work in for many, many years. Gus hints at an aspect of Walter here that we haven't touched on yet, that's bolstered by his desire to show himself as a man who can take care of his family, a component of his ego and his pride that serves as a great harm to Walter. Perhaps because of his own father's death, Walter feels that he should provide for his family to the best of his abilities, give them what he never had, what his own father was unable to give him. It could be the way he lived his life up to this moment, a life where he's had to sit on the sidelines and watch other, greater men succeed, and even deign to offer their help in providing for his family. Walt is trying to prove himself to the world, and to himself, that he can be the great man he feels he was destined to be, that his former glory is not gone and over, but alive and well, and that he can be the man who will bring his family to new heights of prosperity, something that the keenly astute Gus strikes at perfectly. Throughout this time, Walter remains quite devoted and motivated by his family, or so it seems. He's actively seeking more wealth, this time to the tune of $3 million offered to him by Gus Fring, though as I said, at this time, he still thinks he's doing what he's doing for the benefit of his family, even if his actions have led to the shooting of his brother-in-law by Tuco's cousins. This still ends up helping Walt in a way, as he's able to secure an annual contract with Gus after this event. But he's still, even now, quite hesitant about his role in the criminal world, and attempts to end his life by running his car into a semi before things get even more out of hand. This hesitation is more than just his apprehension towards becoming a criminal. It's the fact that he feels his life is spiraling out of control. He feels as if the walls are closing in on him, as Skylar now has the idea, and rightfully so, that Walt is somehow responsible for Hank's shooting. And though he has this nice new job doing what he loves, he's alone and away from his family, his life's meaning now rendered nearly obsolete. He's still providing for his family like he wanted to, but Gus's words of a man bearing the burden no matter the cost only partially resonated with Walter, as he has a deep-seated desire to not just provide, but to be recognized and loved. And now that he's been banished from his own home to wallow in his own misgivings, his mental state is beginning to falter. Not only that, but there's the fact that his position in this business is far from secure, as he knows if they can get to Hank, they can definitely get to him. His feelings during this time are explained to us when he has this strange mental breakdown during the fly sequence, where he tells Jesse that he had the perfect time to die, the perfect situation where he could become the hero his family needed. And now it's gone, and rather than the martyred hero, he's the ostracized villain. To bolster the idea that Walt is indeed becoming the villain is his murder of the two men who shot Tomas. No one is rooting for these guys, that's for sure. And it's not necessarily the act of murdering these men that's shocking, but the way in which Walter does so, particularly how he guns down the one left living after he runs them over with his car. Here, Walt murders this man with no hesitation whatsoever, an act he does about as casually as you would swat a fly. This shows us that whatever reservations Walt had about murdering people earlier on in this series is gone, and he's now more than comfortable murdering someone if he deems it to be the right thing to do. This is evident with how he handles his inevitable death after this event when he plots to murder Gale, as even though after the fact, he acknowledges that Gale didn't deserve to die, he would in no way value Gale's life over his own, and if he had to have Gale killed again, he would do so in order to save his own life. These last three murders are definitely sympathetic and understandable, as if a child were murdered, someone we cared about were in harm's way, and our lives were in danger. I imagine many of us would react in a similar fashion to Walt. Even though Walt's reasons for taking these actions are understandable, they all fall under the category of being unnecessary, as well as being terrible stepping stones in Walt's journey towards evil. As again, Tomas may have never gotten shot, and Gale wouldn't have needed to be murdered had Walt not got involved in this business. After the murder of Gale and Victor, Walt is left between a rock and a hard place, as a man like Walt would rather die than lay down and let Gus have his way, as he already proved with his murder of Gale. Throughout the ensuing saga to get the better of Gus, Walt honestly changes very little. There's a gradual shift in the dynamic of his marriage as Skylar both comes to accept and revile Walt, and there are several different times where he attempts to manipulate Jesse into doing things that he needs him to do. But though many different things obviously occurred during this time, Walt remains virtually the same up until episode 9 of season 4, where the real change starts to happen. After his fight with Jesse, after he realizes that he's losing this battle with Gus, and that he's losing Jesse, his proverbial son, Walter, in an emotional breakdown with Walter Jr., realizes that he's made not just one mistake, but several, and they're catching up to him as he sits there waiting for the seconds to pass him by. This is a rare moment of humility for Walter. His pride has brought him to the lowest point he's been at since Gus had him watch Victor bleed to death. And this is only the beginning. And once Jesse has come back from Mexico, Walter is finished, and he panics like it's the end of the world, which it essentially is. Thus begins a mad dash to save his own life, where Walt poisons a child to regain the trust of Jesse, puts the life of one of his neighbors in danger when he's attempting to get into his home, and blows up a nursing home. 3 acts which show us that Walt has now gone so far off the deep end that he's very much willing to sacrifice the lives of innocents to save his own skin. I know the bombing of the nursing home didn't directly affect any innocents, but it very well could have, and the fact that he was willing to even entertain such an idea is telling of Walt's increasing lack of morality. This saga ends in the death of Gus, Tyrus, Hector Salamanca, and 2 unnamed thugs at the lab. And although all these people are players of the same game Walt is engaged in, his plot to murder Gus is rife with terrible actions that highlight the intense selfishness of Walter White. During his time working for Gus, we see a man who's comfortable with his new place in this illicit industry, one who's growing increasingly estranged from his wife and immersed in a false reality of lies and manipulation. But his actions during this period give us insight into what's been forming inside Walter White. A monster who has little to no care for anyone other than himself, no matter how hard he tries to pretend otherwise. And with that, we move on to the final chapter in Walter's life, his time as the new lord of the meth business. Here is where Walter transforms from a man teetering on the edge of noble intent and criminality to completely toppling over into the territory of ruthless drug lord. Walt's attitude had already begun to change, which we had seen previously in the famous "I am the one who knocks" speech to Skylar. But now his pride and ego have inflated to such a high degree that he's become almost unrecognizable from the man he once was. Sure, he's still Walt, but it's as if he's attempted to absorb Gus into his own personality following his demise, taking up his mantle as kingpin of the meth business, and acting as if he's now suddenly the man of the hour, the boss who shouldn't be questioned. He proposes a partnership with Jesse and Mike, but in reality, he now sees himself as the head of this operation, and though he acquiesces to their suggestions and advice on occasion, namely Mike's, he still feels like he's the man who's in control and the one making the decisions. Though he's blissfully unaware of what he's done to Skylar at the start of this season, acting as if the world has been righted and nothing at all is wrong anymore, he soon realizes that he's damaged his wife in a way that leaves her terrified of him and the business he's engaged in, leaving her feeling like a helpless hostage in the world of Walter White. This doesn't matter to Walt though, as when Skylar attempts to one-up him and tell him that she's basically going to make his life a living hell until he renounces his business or dies, Walt pushes her into a corner and shows her that she, like those around him, are powerless in the face of the indomitable will of Heisenberg. I haven't talked about this yet, but before, when Walt would engage in criminal behavior, he would don his signature pork pie hat, an indication that Walt was leaving behind the meek and mild-mannered chemistry teacher known as Walter White, and becoming Heisenberg, the merciless and brutal drug baron, a sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde dynamic. Now, Walter no longer has any need for the hat, as he's become so enmeshed between these two personalities that they have melded together to become one person. We do see him don the hat a few times throughout this season, but when he does, it's arbitrary at best. However, there are a few more instances in this season where Walter is ashamed of what he does when giving in fully to this Heisenberg alter ego, which we'll be covering shortly. Walter is now totally content, in fact more than content, with the new life he's living. He's finally on top, reaching the heights he's always strived for, and he is now the ultimate decider of his destiny and the destinies of those around him. Walt's attitude change here is best explained when he's having a conversation with Jesse at his home after the murder of Drew Sharp, where they discuss the opportunity Walt is given to get out of the meth business for a sizable sum of $5 million. Here he explains to Jesse how he missed out on the success of gray matter by selling his share in the company too early. He envisions the same thing happening if he sells out too early in this business. And more important than that, he tells Jesse that he's in the empire business, not the meth business. This shows us another aspect of Walter's pride and ego, the fact that he's in a way attempting to compete with his former friends and the people who he believes robbed him of what's owed to him, and his children. By expanding his interests in the meth business, he not only provides for his family, but achieves greatness on par with Elliot and Gretchen, an achievement that he can be satisfied with, and one that he can take with him happily to the grave. However, that's not the only component to this desire to create an empire, as Walt explains to Jesse that he now has nothing left in his life, as his wife hates him, his kids are out of the home, and outside of the meth business, he would be nothing but a pitiful car wash owner. It's these ideas that cause Walt to ignore things that he would have once been outraged over, like the murder of Drew Sharp, which the Walter White that we encountered at the beginning of this story certainly wouldn't have stood for. It's also what causes this man to burn through restraints in an excruciatingly painful way, just so he can stop a deal Mike has orchestrated to sell their methylamine, like a rat gnawing through its cage. If Walt's immense amount of self-harming pride wasn't evident enough already, we get a glimpse into how all-consuming it is when Mike calls him out on it during their confrontation at the end of episode 7. Here, Walt doesn't kill Mike because of any rational reason. He does so because Mike has shoved a knife into the very center of what makes Walt the monster that he is. And as I've said before, Walt isn't a man who's good with confronting emotional or personal truths. This prodding causes Walt to go into a mad rage that ends in the death of Mike, an event that he's immediately remorseful for once the adrenaline wears off. One of those moments of humility and shame that managed to permeate his new status as a near ruthless drug lord. However, this doesn't last for long, as soon after Mike's demise, he enacts a plan to murder the 10 former members of Gus's crew that's nothing short of brilliant, as having them all murdered within a 2-minute window to avoid the others being placed in protective custody following the murder of one is a plan worthy of one who could be called a criminal mastermind. If we weren't convinced of how far down the rabbit hole Walt had really gone, this shows us that he's very much living up to being the brutal kingpin he aspires to be. Before this event, but following Mike's death, we see once again a low in his relationship with Jesse. Their relationship has risen and fallen throughout the series, and after Jesse decides to go his own way, Walt drops all of his supposed care for Jesse and starts being petty towards him, making sure that whenever Jesse is involved in any of his ongoing business, he makes a point to belittle him, reminding him that he's out and he has no say in anything. This is Walt's pride taking over once again, as though he cares for Jesse and views him as a son, as I said earlier. His care for the man is superseded by his own selfish desire to mold Jesse into the vessel that will carry on his legacy once he dies. After all, what good is an empire if it crumbles after your demise? This plan to build an empire may have sufficed for Walter if he were to live, say, another 20 years or so, as I'm sure he believed that had he been given enough time, he could have convinced Skylar to come to her senses and been able to both keep his empire and his family. However, he's taken back to square one once he gets a new diagnosis revealing that his cancer has returned, and he realizes now that if he were to die in 6 months, he'd die a man with no family and a few unknown accomplishments to his name. So in light of this news, Walt has a change of heart, leaves the meth business behind, and tries to repair his relationship with Jesse and his family. This is cut short once Hank discovers the truth about Walt. And once that's happened, and Jesse figures out that Huel was the one who lifted the rice and cigarette from his pocket after all, things begin to spiral horribly out of control for Walt. And though he attempts to lie and manipulate those around him to get the better of everyone, even creating a fake confession that would instigate his own brother-in-law as the man behind the meth business, Walter ultimately loses. And he loses in such an intense way that I'm sure he would scarcely believe it if you had told him that was what was in his future. Not only does he cause the death of Hank and Steve Gomez, but he loses his family and any semblance of a relationship that he once had with Jesse in the process. He ends up with a fate that for Walter is exponentially worse than being jailed. as now he's utterly alone in a frozen hut in the middle of nowhere, left with nothing but his own mistakes and the knowledge that his choices have led to the destruction of not only his life, but the lives of so many others around him. In the end, Walt manages to redeem himself slightly as he murders the men who have been torturing Jesse, freeing him and avenging the deaths of Hank and Steve Gomez all at once. And just before this end, Walt reveals to us all that everything he had done, everything he claimed to do in the name of his family, was done for one person, and one person only: himself. These actions were nothing more than a man whose life was as bland and average as they come, attempting to prove to the world that he wasn't the underachiever that he felt he was, that he was more than his broken-down house, his boring marriage, and his underwhelming career. He was Walter White, the great Heisenberg, the man who took a business into the grasp of his hands, rent it asunder, and remade it into a blood-soaked monument to his own selfish desire to be recognized, to be acknowledged as more than just another set of empty eyes amongst the masses. Walter White, though unbeknownst to him, started this journey as an admirable man, a man who worked 2 jobs to make sure his family had a roof over their head, one who sacrificed his passion and his aspirations, for whatever reason, to ensure that they were provided for, healthy, and happy, no matter the cost. A quote from the film A Bronx Tale is very much applicable here. A quote which is derived from something Chaz Palminteri's father said to him when he was younger, where he told the young Chaz that it doesn't take much strength to pull a trigger, but try getting up every morning and working for a living, and see who the tough guy is then. That was Walter in episode 1, a tough guy who worked 2 jobs every day for the sake of his family. His transition into the meth business was initially well-intentioned, and he certainly worked for the money he earned, but everything he did for his own sake, for his own selfish desire to be a self-made man who needn't seek help from other people. He could have instantly solved all of his problems and avoided all the lies, the manipulation, the death, and the tragedy, if he simply had an ounce of humility and accepted Elliot's offer to work at Gray Matter. But no, that wouldn't have been enough for Walter White. And though he was an admirable and good-natured family man who garnered the respect and love of colleagues and family members alike, his mad effort to prove himself revealed the truth of who he was inside: an intensely selfish, prideful, egomaniac, one whose comfort sowing discord, lies, and manipulating others caused the indirect and direct deaths of 201 people, justified or not, as well as the suffering of their families and the suffering of countless others through the proliferation of methamphetamine. Walter may have started out as the hero of the story, but his actions leave him nothing more than a villain by its end, a brutal, merciless man who put himself and his desires above the well-being of those around him, a man who turned from his principles in favor of greed, recognition, and power, a man whose noble intentions served as nothing more than a facade to cover his all-consuming and destructive evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Walt? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured in a future episode while you're at it. If you liked this video and want to see more like it appearing in your feed, click the subscribe button to keep up on the latest episodes, and feel free to leave a like while you're at it. Thank you once again to all of my existing subscribers for your continued and incredible support. If you'd like to support the channel even further, consider signing up as a patron over on Patreon. You can find a link to Patreon down in the description. Thank you to everyone who signed up so far, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed in the description for occasional updates on the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.